Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into a topic that's often overlooked but incredibly important to understand: why Africans were always seen as a threat. From ancient times to the modern era, the African continent and its people have been portrayed as a threat in various ways: politically, economically, and culturally. But why is that? What are the roots of this perception? And how has it shaped global history?
Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll have a clearer view of how deep this narrative runs and why it still matters today. One of the main reasons Africans were historically seen as a threat is because of the continent's immense natural wealth. Africa is home to vast reserves of gold, diamonds, oil, and other precious minerals. European explorers and colonizers quickly realized the continent's riches could make or break empires. This wealth made African kingdoms powerful trading partners, but also prime targets for exploitation. The abundance of resources meant that controlling Africa was synonymous with controlling economic power. This created fear among colonial powers and even rival African states. They worried about what could happen if Africans retained full control of their own wealth. Even today, foreign powers and corporations fight for a stake in African resources, fueling conflicts and instability to maintain influence. This ongoing struggle perpetuates the narrative that Africans must be controlled or contained because they hold the keys to vast, untapped wealth that could shift global power balances overnight. Another reason Africans were seen as a threat lies in their history of fierce resistance. From the kingdoms of Nubia fighting off ancient Egyptian expansion to the Zulu wars against British colonizers, Africans have a long legacy of defending their lands and sovereignty. During the transatlantic slave trade, countless revolts on slave ships and plantations were led by Africans who refused to accept enslavement. These acts of defiance terrified slave traders and plantation owners who knew that enslaved Africans outnumbered them in many regions. The Haitian Revolution, led by enslaved Africans and their descendants, stands as a testament to this indomitable spirit. It sent shockwaves through the colonial world, proving that Africans could overthrow their oppressors and build independent nations. This fear of organized African resistance shaped policies and propaganda that painted Africans as dangerous, rebellious, and needing to be controlled to prevent uprisings. Africa's cultural power has also long been perceived as a threat by outside forces. African civilizations have contributed immensely to art, music, language, and spirituality. This cultural richness inspired and sometimes intimidated colonizers who sought to erase African identities to assert dominance. African traditions, storytelling, and communal ways of living posed an ideological threat to Western individualistic values. Enslaved Africans carried their cultures with them to the Americas, where African rhythms, dance, and spirituality transformed entire societies. Jazz, blues, reggae, and hip-hop, all rooted in African heritage, have influenced global pop culture. This unstoppable cultural influence counters narratives of inferiority and challenges dominant cultures. Throughout history, efforts to suppress African cultures failed because the people kept their traditions alive, adapting and influencing every place they touched. This cultural resilience continues to empower African communities worldwide, unsettling those who benefit from cultural homogenization. In the 20th century, as African nations gained independence, new fears emerged. The rise of Pan-Africanism, the idea of a unified Africa working together for shared prosperity, alarmed former colonial powers. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Patrice Lumumba of the Congo inspired movements for unity and self-determination. If African nations cooperated politically and economically, they could rival global powers. This potential for unity made African leaders targets for coups, assassinations, and destabilization campaigns, often backed by foreign interests. The fear of a strong, united Africa persists today. Movements like the African Union and initiatives for economic integration threaten the status quo of dependency and exploitation. While challenges remain, the idea of African solidarity continues to worry those who benefit from a divided continent. This political threat highlights just how powerful collective action can be. Finally, the perception of Africans as a threat persists in modern media and politics.
Negative stereotypes in news coverage, films, and literature often portray Africa as a place of chaos, disease, and conflict. These images overshadow stories of innovation, resilience, and growth. They fuel xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiments, framing African migrants and refugees as threats to Western societies. At the same time, African excellence in sports, academia, and business challenges these stereotypes, showing the world the brilliance and potential that exist across the continent. This tension between negative portrayals and undeniable success keeps the narrative alive, but also creates opportunities to rewrite it. By amplifying authentic African voices and stories, we can dismantle old fears and build new understandings rooted in respect and equality. Religion played a major part in shaping the perception of Africans as a threat. When European colonizers arrived, they often used Christianity as both a justification and a weapon. They painted African spiritual systems as pagan or evil, branding the people who practiced them as dangerous heathens needing salvation or suppression. African religions, however, were deeply rooted, complex, and influential. They offered systems of governance, social order, and community cohesion that challenged colonial rule. Missionaries sometimes feared losing followers to African traditions, which they saw as competition. Resistance movements often intertwined with spiritual leaders and traditional beliefs, like the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, which blended political and spiritual defiance. This intersection of faith and freedom frightened colonial authorities and fed into the myth that African beliefs were backward, yet powerful enough to overthrow foreign control. Today, many Africans embrace both indigenous beliefs and global religions, proving that African spirituality was never fully erased, another sign of enduring resilience. African intellectual contributions have often been downplayed or stolen outright. Many people don't know that Africa was home to ancient centers of learning like Timbuktu in Mali, where scholars studied astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy long before European universities were founded. These intellectual legacies counter the myth of Africa as a dark continent without knowledge or innovation. Colonizers and slave traders feared African intellectual independence because it challenged their narrative of racial superiority. Even in the diaspora, Black thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois and Chinua Achebe pushed back against stereotypes, proving African intellect and perspective shaped world thought. This threat to the status quo inspired suppression, censorship, and the erasure of African achievements from mainstream history books. Reclaiming these stories today helps dismantle false perceptions and celebrate the true depth of African genius. Africans' ability to build self-sufficient economies has also been seen as a threat. Pre-colonial African societies often had sophisticated trade networks, agriculture, and craftsmanship that sustained entire kingdoms. Empires like Mali, Ghana, and Great Zimbabwe thrived through internal trade and resource management. European powers sought to break this self-sufficiency to create dependency on foreign markets. Today, African nations that push for economic independence, like rejecting exploitative trade deals or building local industries, face resistance from global powers that profit from keeping African economies reliant. This fear of an economically independent Africa drives debt traps, trade barriers, and political interference. When African nations succeed in asserting economic autonomy, they prove the world wrong and remind everyone that the continent doesn't need saving. It needs fair opportunities to flourish on its own terms. Africa has the youngest and fastest growing population in the world. This demographic reality excites some investors but alarms others. A youthful, dynamic population means a massive labor force, vibrant markets, and creative potential. However, some political and economic leaders fear the rise of a generation that demands change and accountability. Throughout history, young Africans have driven movements for independence, civil rights, and democracy. Today's youth are tech-savvy, globally connected, and unafraid to challenge old systems. From Nigeria's #EndSARS protests to Pan-African startup founders, young Africans are rewriting the continent's future. This energy can be perceived as a threat by corrupt leaders or foreign interests who benefit from the status quo. Empowering Africa's youth is key to changing this narrative from threat to opportunity. Africa's natural environment holds not only resources, but also solutions to global crises like climate change. African communities have long practiced sustainable farming, forestry, and water management. Colonial exploitation, however, ignored these systems, causing deforestation, desertification, and biodiversity loss. Today, African nations are reclaiming indigenous environmental knowledge to restore ecosystems and combat climate change. This stewardship threatens industries that profit from environmental destruction. For example, communities opposing destructive mining or oil drilling often face violence and disinformation campaigns. By defending their lands, Africans protect not just their communities, but the planet. This environmental leadership challenges narratives that paint Africa as helpless in the face of climate disasters. Instead, it shows Africans are essential leaders in the global fight for sustainability. The African diaspora is another source of power that has historically been seen as threatening. From the Caribbean to the Americas to Europe, people of African descent have organized movements for civil rights, social justice, and equality. These global connections form networks that challenge racism and exploitation wherever they appear. Solidarity movements like Pan-African Congresses or today's global Black Lives Matter protests show that when Africans and their descendants unite across borders, they amplify each other's struggles and victories. This unity unsettles those invested in maintaining divisions. When diaspora communities invest back in Africa through remittances or business ventures, they also shift economic power back to African hands. This global connection is a reminder that African strength extends far beyond the continent's borders. Modern African innovation is often underestimated, but increasingly impossible to ignore. African entrepreneurs and inventors are solving local problems with global impact, from mobile banking like M-Pesa in Kenya to renewable energy solutions in Rwanda. These homegrown technologies challenge the narrative that Africa is only a receiver of aid or outside expertise. Instead, Africans are producing solutions that other parts of the world are now adopting. This flips the script and threatens industries that rely on Africa as a market for foreign products. By developing local tech ecosystems, Africans are creating jobs, retaining talent, and proving that the future of innovation is African too. In the world of sports, African athletes have always challenged stereotypes and inspired millions. From historic figures like Ethiopian runner Abebe Bikila to football stars like Didier Drogba, African excellence on the field threatens outdated notions of inferiority. Yet this dominance has often been met with exploitation. Talent is extracted for foreign leagues, while local sports infrastructure remains underdeveloped. Athletes who speak out on political or social issues sometimes face backlash for using their platform. Despite this, sports remain a powerful force for reshaping global perceptions of Africa, showing discipline, talent, and unity on a world stage. African art, whether visual, literary, or performing, has long been a vessel for truth-telling and resistance. During colonial times, artists and writers used their work to critique oppression and imagine freedom. Today, African filmmakers, musicians, and authors continue to challenge stereotypes and reclaim narratives. Nollywood, Afrobeats, and the global reach of African literature show how African creativity captivates the world. This artistic power can threaten gatekeepers of mainstream media, who often struggle to control the authentic stories Africans tell. By celebrating African stories on their own terms, artists dismantle myths and expand how the world sees Africa. African communities often emphasize collective well-being over individual gain. This communal approach contrasts sharply with Western individualism and can be misunderstood as backward or inefficient.
In reality, African extended family systems, community networks, and shared responsibilities provide resilience in the face of economic hardship and political instability. These structures threaten systems that profit from isolating people and breaking down support networks.
When African communities stand together, they resist exploitation and build local solutions for education, healthcare, and economic survival. This communal strength remains one of the continent's greatest assets. African women have always played vital roles in leadership, resistance, and community building. From queens like Nzinga of Angola to modern activists like Lima Gbowee of Liberia, African women's strength challenges patriarchal systems locally and globally. Yet their leadership is often overlooked or suppressed. When African women organize, they shift power dynamics, protect communities, and drive social change. This empowerment can be perceived as a threat by those invested in keeping women marginalized. Supporting African women's education, entrepreneurship, and political participation unlocks massive potential and breaks old narratives of victimhood. While religion was used to control African societies, it also became a tool of resistance and healing. Churches, mosques, and indigenous faith systems provided refuge and a sense of identity. Spiritual leaders often led movements for justice and liberation, blending faith with activism. This spiritual resilience challenges attempts to strip Africans of their sense of self-worth and unity. Today, African spirituality continues to inspire movements for environmental justice, human rights, and cultural revival. This enduring faith in community and justice keeps hope alive, unsettling those who depend on despair to maintain control. African fashion, cuisine, and languages are influencing global trends at an unprecedented rate. Designers draw inspiration from African patterns in textiles, chefs fuse African ingredients into global menus, and African languages shape slang and pop culture worldwide. This export of African culture disrupts industries that once ignored or appropriated it without credit. Now, Africans are reclaiming ownership, telling their own stories, and profiting from their heritage. This challenges outdated perceptions that Africa has nothing to offer, showing instead that African creativity sets trends that the world follows. A new generation of Africans is demanding education systems that reflect their own histories, cultures, and contributions. Across the continent, scholars and educators are decolonizing curriculums, centering African perspectives, and teaching youth to take pride in their identity. This shift threatens old power structures that relied on misinformation and historical erasure to control minds. By reclaiming their stories, young Africans gain confidence to build futures on their own terms, free from limiting stereotypes. Social media has given Africans a powerful tool to challenge narratives in real time. African influencers, journalists, and everyday citizens now have a platform to tell their own stories, share successes, and expose injustices. Hashtags like #CongoIsBleeding or #BringBackOurGirls have brought global attention to issues that mainstream media often ignore. This digital power shifts influence away from traditional gatekeepers and empowers Africans to set the agenda. For those who fear losing control over the narrative, this is perhaps the biggest threat of all, a continent that can speak for itself, unfiltered and unstoppable. African nations are pioneering health solutions that challenge global health inequalities. From local vaccine production to community-driven health campaigns tackling malaria, HIV/AIDS, and Ebola, Africans have developed homegrown strategies that often outperform outside interventions. This self-reliance in healthcare can threaten foreign pharmaceutical companies and aid organizations that profit from dependency. By innovating in healthcare, Africans prove they can solve their own challenges and even offer solutions to the world, flipping the script from needing help to being leaders in medical breakthroughs. Africa's cities are some of the fastest-growing urban centers in the world. With this growth comes innovation in architecture, housing, and urban planning that adapts to unique local needs. African architects and city planners are designing smart cities and green buildings that challenge imported models of urbanization. This local ingenuity threatens industries that once dominated by imposing one-size-fits-all solutions. As African cities grow, they are becoming hubs for regional and global trade, shifting economic power and showing that African urban futures are bright, self-determined, and modern on their own terms. African farmers have been feeding communities for centuries with indigenous knowledge about crops, climate, and soil. This knowledge, passed down through generations, has helped communities survive despite droughts, pests, and exploitation. Today, agroecology movements and smart farming technologies are blending tradition and innovation to boost food security sustainably. These homegrown agricultural successes threaten multinational agribusinesses that profit from seed patents and chemical dependencies. When African farmers reclaim their seeds, land, and methods, they protect local food systems and show that African agriculture can thrive without foreign exploitation. Across the continent, young people are leading powerful movements for democracy, gender equality, and climate action. Youth activists use social media, music, and protests to demand accountability from governments and corporations. Their courage challenges political elites and international players who benefit from corrupt systems. From Sudan's revolution to Uganda's climate strikes, youth-led activism is reshaping what power looks like in Africa. This energy scares those who fear an empowered, educated, and connected generation. But it also signals hope for a new era driven by fearless young Africans. African scientists are breaking barriers in fields like genetics, renewable energy, and space technology. Countries like South Africa have invested heavily in astronomy and nuclear research, hosting world-class telescopes and labs. These scientific advances threaten the outdated stereotype that Africa only consumes knowledge but doesn't produce it. By leading cutting-edge research, African scientists inspire local students and change perceptions globally.